In this tutorial, we will explore how to use Couchbase SDK for the Go programming language with their newest version 2 using module system. Before exploring the new API, a quick reminder. Currently, Couchbase Server stores and organizes documents in buckets, which are usually used by one application to persist all the information that it needs, and where schemas for the documents are usually very different from one another. In a future Couchbase version, the storage will include two new constructs, collections and scopes. For now, this is only available as developer preview feature. Collections are a new organizational container to group similar or related documents. This will be the closest to what we know as tables in relational databases, but still with a free schema. A scope is a mechanism to group multiple collections. Applications can be assigned per scope access rights, allowing each application to access only those collections it requires. There is more information in the link below, or use the camera to use the QR code to get it to the website. The SDK version 2 is ready for those changes. For now, it uses a default collection to connect to the bucket, and the scopes are not really required. There are a lot of new features, but for now my favorite is the improved automatic retries that handle resiliency within a timeout window, for temporary errors or if a document was locked in the first attempt. One big change to keep in mind though is that now buckets use lazy initialization, so connecting to it does not guarantee that connection success, and that will be evaluated until you need to perform the first operation. For this example, we will use Go 1.14, but even 1.13 has good support for the new module system. And then we will deploy a Couchbase server to test against using Docker, which I hope you're familiar with. Otherwise, you can refer to the installation section in the Couchbase website to find alternatives. To get the Couchbase Docker image, and for that we're gonna go to hub.docker.com and search for Couchbase. Once we find it, we can come here. We can grab any of these tags. For this example, I'm gonna use the enterprise version, so I can do here docker Couchbase. You can scroll down here, and you can again copy this entire command. Make sure that you add the version that we just got, which is this one, and do the same, which is going to start a new container opening all the ports that we need with the name db, and with this -d is going to be sent to the background. So if I do this, that's going to be enough to start my container. The container is running first. So now we see that it's running. We see that the ports are open, so we can go to the installation here. You go to HTTP localhost 8091, you get to the installation screen. We select setup new cluster, define any name. Accept the terms and conditions. For this exercise, we're just going to use the data service, so we can uncheck all the other services. And we're going to use just 1 GB for this total storage space. So now we see the interface, and we can start by adding our first bucket. Here in advanced settings, we're going to disable the replicas because we only have one server, and we're going to use the flush option so that we can come back at any time, and selecting the bucket we can clear the entire content of the bucket. Immediately after that, we can go to security. Let me expand the screen here, and we're going to add that. We're going to give it access to the new bucket, and we're going to give application access, data service, and that should be enough. Okay, so now we can see the bucket, everything is empty, not documents, so we're ready to start writing the application. Let's start by turning this into a module. I usually use an editor config file to make sure that the style on my files is consistent, even though I can use Go font. You can use tabs or spaces, doesn't matter. So now my next step is gonna be to import the new Couchbase SDK. And for that, we're gonna go back to the terminal. I forgot to do that. And then we're gonna see that the new dependency should be added into the Go mode file. You can see it here. If you're using Golang like myself, you can enable the modules integration. Otherwise, you're gonna see this red highlighting error. And that will be enough. Now I'm gonna start adding some of the code. I think for this example, what I'm gonna do is everything that is not related to Couchbase, I'm gonna add it in advance so that I don't bother you and I don't confuse you with all that code. And then later I'll go back to the Couchbase specific code. We're gonna be creating a service that is nothing but a contact list application that allows to either create a new contact or return a new contact by its ID. The details, as I said before, I'm going to be hiding everything that is not related to Couchbase itself. So for example, I'm using this configuration object, which is nothing that a file that is getting all the settings for the database from command line flags. And also for the web server, I'm using GoChi, but that's sort of irrelevant. We're going to be exposing two endpoints. One of them is going to allow me to create a new contact with this using the post method to this API/contact, and the create handle is pretty simple. Like, we're just receiving the JSON payload to create the new entry in the database, and if I cannot read the request, I'm going to be returning a status failed dependency, or if the format is not in the right JSON schema, then we're going to return a status bad request. And finally, if everything goes right, we're just going to return a message that says item created. To return an item by contact ID is pretty much straightforward as well. We're just gonna get the contact ID from the path in the URL. We're gonna validate that it's not empty, like that it doesn't have empty spaces on either side. And then finally, we're gonna be getting that contact ID. If the item is not found in the database, we're gonna return a 404 status not found. Or if there is any other error, we're gonna just return status failed dependency to the downstream. And finally, we're gonna turn that response that we're getting from the database into a valid contact model from the application. So let's go to the Couchbase connection, and this is where everything is gonna start. This is where we're gonna be returning where things start getting interesting. This is the way I create a connection to my Couchbase cluster. And as you can see, the first argument is just the server URL. In this case, it's localhost because I'm using my container. But then I'm passing this cluster options object, and here I'm passing the username and password that is going to be used to connect to my bucket. This is for simple authentication. Like if you needed to use something like an SSL certificate, there are other options in this object that you can use. And let me explore very quickly here. If I want to add that authentication, like I can define a custom authenticator here, which I'm not going to be using in this case. I'm going to just be using this shortcut for user and password. And then here you can define individual timeouts for the operation that are going to be set by default for the entire bucket. And as you can see, there are like more options supported, but right now I'm just defining the connection timeout and the key value per timeout because I'm just using the data service. Here is also something too useful options. I'm gonna use them, but not right now. One is the retry strategy. So this is where I personally am starting to like this version 2 of the SDK, because now I have a little bit more control of when do I want to do the retry. By default, this is already set, and this is, by the way, like this tracer option is experimental. So even in the code documentation, it says that you shouldn't consider this to be a final API, so it might change over time. So again, for now, like I'm just gonna connect this. The orphan report config is gonna be used to report statistics for when some items are no longer found in the bucket. Finally, we have the circuit breaker config, which is pretty awesome. Here, by default, of course, I don't want to disable it. And then here I can define what are the settings that I want to use for the circuit breaker. In this case, I'm expecting to get at least 100 calls before I can take a decision on whether or not to open the circuit. I'm saying that 5% is going to be my error threshold before I open the circuit, and then I define the sleeping and rolling windows. So here I'm checking that the cluster was created correctly, and if not, I'm returning the error. And this is one of the new methods that you should be aware of. Like here you need to verify, or you can verify, that the cluster has been connected correctly. This is an option that you might want to use if you want to take advantage of the lazy loading. So if you didn't want to wait at all and you just want to move on and evaluate later if the cluster was connected, there are other options. But I personally use this, I find this utility very useful, the wait until it's ready. I have, in my case, this is hard-coded, but like everything that you see here should come from some configurable properties ideally. So in my case, I'm waiting for 5 seconds to see if the cluster is ready. If not, I'm gonna return an error. And then you can define what is the desired state after this time, after 5 seconds. So in my case, for most of my applications, I really want to make sure that the cluster is fully available online. But you can also say, you can check for a different state, like if the cluster is degraded, or if you don't care and if you want to check that the cluster is offline. So that's completely up to you. Same thing, I evaluate the error, and if there is any error in this wait until ready, then I'm going to return that error. Otherwise, I'm just going to open my bucket. If you remember from previous versions, the option was open bucket. Now it's just cluster bucket, where you pass the bucket name. And then, as we said in the previous presentation, the bucket has to point to a default collection, and that collection is the one that is going to give us access to all the different methods to manipulate data. So we're going to return that. So instead of doing bucket.get, which it was the old API, like you can see that that's not even available. Here I can do the same, where I can wait until the bucket is ready. It's pretty much the same as what we did with the cluster itself. And we can have access to the collections, indexes, and so on. But then again, like if I wanted to do any mutation on the data, or if I wanted to fetch data from the collection, instead of using the bucket, now I do it from the collection object itself. And you're gonna find the operations that were previously located at the bucket level. So for now, let's just add the wait for the bucket. Oops, it should be here. Wait until it's ready, and we're going to do exactly the same. 5 seconds. Go CB. Wait until ready actions. Desired state. And we're going to do exactly the state online. So good. We're going to just give the same stance so that it looks consistent. Okay, we have our connection connect to the cluster. Something to notice here. Let me check on these options. Like you can see here how I'm passing the flag values to my command line arguments. And if I change the username, something that I personally didn't like is like, this is an incorrect username, okay? So when I run my program, you can see from the console here that this is going to fail because that's expected. But the problem is, like here, I'm just getting unambiguous timeout, and I can see that the retry reasons is not ready, but nothing here says that the problem is with authentication. So that's something to keep in mind that you might have to validate for. So let's set now the right user. run the program once more. Now it says that I'm connected to the cluster, so I'm ready to start implementing my mutation operations. That performs all the logic of the service. So as you can see here, I have a pointer to a Couchbase collection, and then I have the means here to inject that collection from elsewhere. So if I go back to my main file, as you can see here, remember that this is the step where I created the connection, and then later I injected to my service. So now that my service is wired, I can basically make use of these functions. The way to create a new entry in Couchbase is essentially the same, except that right now we're using the collection object. We do the insert. One thing that I'm using here is I'm just building an ID that is based on the contact email, replacing the add character with a dash, and then I'm attaching the phone number. So that combination should be unique. That's fine for me. That means that I allow either duplicity or phone or email, but not both at the same time. And then the insert options, you can see here that we can provide an expiry, which is the same expiration or TTL that we were using in previous versions of the SDK. And then I can specify a different timeout from the one that we define in the connection itself. So remember, like when we created the Couchbase connection here, we were providing a default key value per timeout, but then here we're specifying one per operation if we wanted to. And the reason for that is because for specifically for persisting, you might want to have something longer than for retrieving, because Couchbase has to perform more operations like find the right server to persist, and it might have to resolve certain conflicts, or you might want to give room for retries if the document is locked or something like that. So that's why it's a good practice to separate these timeouts and not have the same one for both operations. And finally, you can also specify a retry strategy per operation. So that's pretty cool. You can define, again, different settings for your get operation and your insert operation. For now, we're going to leave it as nil, and we're going to be returning an error if something fails, or otherwise we're just like let it go through. Probably we should return the ID, but that's okay. Finally, here to get a contact, we do the function to get contact by ID, and the same thing, we get a get result object that is being returned from the get operation. And the options is pretty cool as well. Like here, if I set this flag as true, when I get this get result back, the response object that I'm gonna get back is gonna include also as part of the metadata of the result the TTL that is left for that particular document. Here, because I'm setting a TTL of 0, that means that the documents are persisted forever. This doesn't make sense. I just wanted to show it as part of the example. So we're going to leave it as false. And then you can use projections. So what that means is like giving all the fields that I have here for this contact struct, I can decide that I want to return just the name, phone number, and email, or I can make it so that it's just name and email if I want it, or you can select whatever options you want, and then the return object is going to contain just those fields, and that's going to help you to save some bandwidth in the network between the Couchbase server and your application. But then just keep in mind that your Couchbase server might be doing more processing by filtering out those settings, so that's something to keep in mind. Again, you can specify a custom timeout for the get operation, and you can specify a retry strategy. Everything else is what we used to have in the old Couchbase. The difference is here that when I get the result back, the result object back, the content method is the one that is going to be doing the mapping between my Couchbase response and then serializing it into this contact object. And finally, we're returning that. So that's pretty much it for the service, and now we can actually test. Creating a request to create an item, so we're going to have to send a post request to the contact API with the contact type application.json, and we're going to pass in the JSON object that matches the model that we define in the contacts service. So now we can actually run it. We got a 200 item created, which is what I was expecting. And if I go here to my Couchbase cluster, now I can go here to my bucket and I should have one document. Here, if you don't see the result, you can go to the classic editor, and there you go, you can see the record here. It's pretty much what I expected. Since I didn't provide a phone number, the ID that the system takes is this one, like email _ empty. It's fine. So now let's try to add a new request to get that record back. And we're gonna do the same, 8080, contact and the ID. And let's see if this works. Great, we got the record back, and that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do to start using Couchbase in a very basic way, and we're just exploring the new features that come as part of the new SDK. Now that we got all the basic functionality out of the way, we can focus on the stuff that is actually important, that is really cool from this SDK version. In particular, we're going to check on the circuit breaker, and for this example I'm going to be using this CLI tool that I wrote so that we can get access to the bucket without having to use the REST interface that we wrote in the previous example. So here you can see that we're going to be reading this document, the ID of this document. We're going to go back to this commented one in a few. We're using the same configuration, the same constructor for the initialization, and basically we're going to be looping and getting the item over and over again. We're going to use projections so that we only get the name from Couchbase, and we're going to use the specified timeout. Finally, if there is an error, we're going to print the error, and if everything goes right, we're going to print the result. So if I go here to the constructor, the only change that I'm doing from the previous example is to implement this completion callback, which pretty much is going to evaluate if there is an error coming back from Couchbase. We have to return true if that error is somehow expected, or if we return false, that means that is something unexpected, and that should be considered for the circuit breaker. So for now, we're going to say, like, if the error is nil, meaning that no error was registered, we're going to return true, meaning that the callback was completed or the record was completed. Otherwise, in any other case, for any other error, we're going to return false. So if I go here to my client and I run it, you're going to see that it's printing my name, it's printing the name of the record, which is expected, is fine. So we have to be very careful, because if we didn't implement this and we don't evaluate if the error is nil, then that means that in this particular case, everything is going to be considered an error regardless of the state. So if I execute it again, you're going to see that the circuit breaker is going to be triggered right away. You can see it now. And that's pretty cool. You can see that when the error is circuit breaker open, so that you can keep track of the state of the circuit breaker in your metrics. So let's put it back. Oops. Now, here we're going to make another change. Now we're going to try to get some document that doesn't exist at all, and remember that we're evaluating that any error is going to be considered like there was no completion of the callback. So what we're expecting is that because the document doesn't exist, we're going to get an error from Couchbase saying that it doesn't exist, and it's also going to trigger the circuit breaker. You can see it here. So obviously this is a behavior that we don't want, because the fact that a document doesn't exist, for most applications, it doesn't mean like it's a terminal error that should trigger the circuit breaker. It just means that it hasn't been stored yet. Like, it depends a lot on the logic of your application. So the only thing that we have to say here is that the error is null, or the error is equal to goes to be document not found. That means that this is considered a valid case. So now every time that Couchbase returns a document not found, that is still going to be considered a completed statement, and is not going to trigger the circuit breaker. So